The morning Nadine Mercer nearly died the second time, she had flour on her hands and cinnamon in her hair. She heard the SUVs before she saw them. Three of them, black, moving too slow for a mountain town where nobody drove anything newer than 2015. She didn't step to the window. She already knew better than to step to the window. She pressed herself to the wall beside the oven and counted. Doors opening, boots on gravel. The particular silence of men trained not to make sound. Her hands kept moving, portioning dough, crimping edges. The bell above the bakery door didn't ring. That was the moment she understood. Whoever just arrived in Ashridge, they weren't customers. If it were you, standing there with flour on your hands and nowhere left to run, what would you do? Before we go any further, if stories like this one keep you up at night, hit that like button and drop your city or country in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Now let's go back to where it all started, and why Nadine Mercer should have never stopped running. Yeah, she had been in Ashridge for 14 months before she stopped flinching every time a stranger walked through the door. That was the number she tracked. Not days since the bloodshed in Chicago, not weeks since the syndicate collapsed in a cascade of federal raids and retaliatory executions, not months since she'd driven north through 3 states with a prepaid phone, $4,000 in small bills, and a name she'd borrowed from a woman who died in a car accident in Ohio in 2019. She tracked it in terms of flinches. How many times per shift did her body seize up, her eyes cut to exits, her fingers go cold? 14 months in, it was down to twice a day. That was progress. That was almost peace. The bakery was called Holt's, and it had belonged to the same family since 1987. Margaret Holt was 71, moved like 60, and smelled permanently of brown butter and vanilla extract. She'd hired Nadine, who went by Claire now, Claire Novak, within 15 minutes of meeting her because the woman who'd been working mornings had just had a second knee replaced, and nobody else in Ashridge wanted to start their shift at 4:15 a.m. Margaret didn't ask many questions. Small towns are better at minding their own business than people give them credit for. Nadine was grateful for that every single morning. She liked the dark of it. The particular silence of a mountain town at 4 a.m. The way the cold came down off the ridgeline and pressed against the bakery windows while the ovens heated up inside. She liked the rhythm, starter dough, scaling, mixing, proofing. The way it demanded enough concentration to silence the other thoughts without demanding so much that she couldn't hear the parking lot. She liked that the job required her hands and left her eyes free. Old habits. She'd been a logistics coordinator for what she'd believed, at the time, was a private financial consulting firm. She had an MBA from Northwestern, a talent for encrypted financial architecture, and a particular gift for making complex money flows look like nothing at all on paper. The firm had recruited her during her final semester. The salary offer was almost offensive in how good it was. She'd said yes without fully understanding why the number was that high. She understood later. By the time she understood, she was already 2 years deep. By the time she tried to get out, she'd seen things that made getting out a complicated proposition. By the time Chicago collapsed, 6 federal task forces, 11 simultaneous arrests, 4 people dead in the parking garage of the syndicate's primary holding company. She was the only person in the operational chain who was still alive and still walking free. She didn't know if that made her lucky or marked. She assumed marked, drove north, and became Claire Novak. Margaret's granddaughter Becca worked afternoons and weekends. She was 23, talked constantly, and had taken a shine to Nadine in the way young women sometimes did with older women who said very little. She read the silence as wisdom instead of caution. Nadine let her read it that way. They got along fine. Becca made the coffee drinks and handled social media and occasionally burned the croissants when she got absorbed in her phone. Nadine didn't correct her much. Correcting people drew attention. There was also a man named Ray who came in most mornings around 6:15 to sit at the corner table with a newspaper and a bear claw. He was retired, maybe 65, and he watched the room the way people did when they'd spent a long time watching rooms. Nadine had cataloged him inside her first week. Former law enforcement, probably local or county, probably not someone still on anyone's payroll. She'd reached that conclusion and filed it away. He'd never given her reason to revise it. She had a small apartment above a hardware store 2 blocks away. She paid cash, kept the space sparse, and kept a go bag inside a hollow section of wall she'd carved out with a utility knife 3 days after moving in. She'd done it methodically, spackled it smooth, repainted. You'd never know. That was the thing about this kind of life. You did those things not because you planned to need them. You did them because the person who needed them and hadn't prepared them didn't survive long enough to wish they had. The morning everything shifted, she'd been up since 3:40, which was normal. She'd started the levain, gotten the first proofing racks loaded, and was pulling the day's initial cinnamon rolls from the upper oven when she heard the cars. She'd already noted the absence of Margaret's station wagon in the side lot. The old woman was visiting her daughter in Roanoke for the week, leaving Nadine to open and Becca to close. Normal week. Nothing expected. She pressed herself to the wall. Listened. 3 vehicles. She reconstructed it by sound. Gravel displacement, engine weight, the particular tick of high-end suspension cooling. Not tourists. Tourists didn't caravan. Not federal. Federals didn't use black SUVs anymore because everyone expected black SUVs, and the good task forces had learned to arrive in Subarus and contractor vans. Not Kane's people, probably, because Kane's people preferred anonymity over this kind of visible arrival. Visible arrival meant someone who wasn't afraid of being seen. That was somehow worse. She gave it 90 seconds. Then she heard the front door open. She'd left it unlocked at 5:45 as usual for the early regulars, and she straightened up, turned around, and pulled the expression onto her face that she'd spent 14 months perfecting. Warm, tired in a normal way, belonging. The man who walked in first wasn't remarkable on his own. Dark coat, early 40s, the kind of build that came from discipline rather than vanity. He scanned the room in a single pass. Corners, counter, kitchen doorway, and stepped to the left without being asked to, creating a clear sightline back to the entrance. Then he folded his hands and waited. The second man through the door was the one she recognized. She'd never met him. She didn't have to. 14 months of running had required her to learn faces the way other people learned song lyrics, obsessively, involuntarily, as protection against future ambush. She'd memorized every major figure connected to every organization that might eventually come looking for what she carried. She'd memorized them from surveillance photographs and grainy wiretap stills and the occasional news photo where someone appeared in the background of a legitimate business function. Damien Vescari was not someone who appeared in backgrounds. He was 47, 6'2", the kind of face that looked like it had been broken once and healed better for it. He wore a dark gray suit that was too well cut for a mountain town in November, and he carried nothing. No phone, no coffee, no pretense of casual arrival. He looked at the bakery the way certain men looked at everything, with the same flat assessment, the same economy of attention. He wasn't surprised by anything he saw. He was checking whether what he saw matched what he'd been told. Damien Vescari, third-generation Sicilian-American, connected to 6 separate criminal enterprises along the eastern seaboard, suspected architect of the Baltimore port consolidation that had reorganized smuggling infrastructure from Miami to Boston, allegedly responsible for the restructuring of 3 separate Midwest distribution networks after Chicago collapsed, never charged with anything more serious than a 2009 tax dispute that was settled quietly. He was not a real estate investor. He looked at the cinnamon rolls cooling on the rack. Then he looked at Nadine. "You're open," he said. It wasn't a question. She kept her face exactly where it was. "Since 5:45. Can I get you something?" He looked around the space again, slower this time, taking inventory of the property rather than the room. "The previous owner," he said. "Margaret Holt." The way he said her name, even factual, without warmth, landed somewhere cold in Nadine's chest. "She's visiting family," Nadine said. "Back Thursday. If you need to reach her, I own this building," Damien said. "As of this morning." She heard the words. She processed them in the part of her brain that was still Claire Novak, bakery employee, resident of Ashridge for 14 months. That part generated the appropriate response. Confusion, slight alarm, the particular concern of someone whose job might have just changed hands. She let that response reach her face. "I'm sorry," she said. I don't understand. Mrs. Holt owned, said the man by the door. His voice was flat, informational. Damien hadn't moved. He was still watching her with that same flat assessment, and she had the specific cold feeling of someone who'd spent years reading people doing the same thing to her. She made herself hold his gaze, looked away at exactly the right moment. Not too fast, which read as guilty, not too long, which read as aggressive. She looked back at the oven, picked up her towel. Standard redirect. People who worked kitchens redirected to tasks when surprised. It was normal. Is Mrs. Holt all right? She asked. She sold, Damien said, voluntarily. He said that last word with a particular weight, as if he understood what her next question would be. She wanted to ask 12 more things. She asked none of them. Will the bakery stay open? She said. Something shifted in his expression. It was small, barely a millimeter, but she caught it. He hadn't expected that to be her first follow-up. He'd expected something about herself, her job, her hours, her situation. For now, he said. She nodded, turned back to the rack. Cinnamon rolls are fresh. Coffee's behind you, self-serve, $2 by the honor system. She paused. The rent account is on autopay. I'll let Mrs. Holt know to update the recipient. She heard him stand there for another 5 seconds. Then she heard him move toward the door. He paused at the threshold. Claire, he said. Her name, her false name, out of his mouth. She had to work to keep her shoulders from pulling. Yes? The rolls, he said. What's in them besides cinnamon? She turned. Brown butter, cardamom, little bit of black pepper. He looked at her for one more second. Then he walked out. She stayed exactly where she was until she heard the SUVs pull away. Then she set down the towel and looked at her hands. They were shaking. Not much, but she noticed it. She hadn't shaken in 11 months. He bought 3 more buildings that week. She tracked it the way she tracked everything, carefully, without appearing to. The hardware store where she lived, the vacant diner across the square, the old miners' lodge, which had been closed for 6 years and sat at the edge of town like a bad tooth. Then the small office complex on Ridgeback Road where the county assessor worked out of 2 rooms and a filing system that still used paper. Small town. People talked. She heard the name Vescari Capital Group and felt a specific kind of tired. The name was real. She'd looked it up on the library computer the afternoon of his first visit, and there was a website, and there were property holdings, and there was a LinkedIn profile for someone named Damien Vescari that listed him as principal and managing director, and all of it had the texture of something that had been built to be looked at. Legitimate adjacent. Everything just clean enough. She knew exactly what it cost to build a paper trail like that because she had spent 2 years of her life building them for other people. She kept working. She kept the routine locked in. 4:15 a.m., ovens on, dough from the walk-in, the whole sequence exactly as Margaret had written it in the binder she kept taped inside the supply cabinet. She didn't vary the timing. She didn't change her route to work. She didn't drive differently or start shopping at a different grocery store or do any of the nervous things that people who thought they were being watched did and that always gave them away. She bought the same things she always bought. She smiled at the same people. She walked the dog belonging to the couple in the apartment below her every Tuesday and Thursday evening because she'd been doing it since March, and stopping would have been a change. She watched Vescari's operation expand with exactly the kind of attention she'd have given a spreading weather system. His people were good. That was the honest read. They didn't cluster. They didn't drive in convoy after that first day. They arrived singly, in different vehicles, at different times. They dressed for Ashridge, work boots, fleece, neutral colors. The kind of clothing that would read as contractor or tradesman. You could walk past 3 of them in an afternoon and never clock the pattern. She clocked the pattern. She did it because she'd spent 2 years working alongside people who'd spent their whole lives building cover, and she'd learned to read the gaps. What gave them away wasn't behavior. It was the specific quality of their stillness. Regular contractors who were tired or bored had a particular kind of unfocused quality. These men, when they stood still, were not unfocused. Their eyes kept moving even when nothing else did. She cataloged them. 7 on rotation. Probably 3 more she hadn't seen yet. heavy toward the miners' lodge in the evenings, which meant that was the operational center. She didn't write any of this down. She kept it in her head, where it couldn't be found. Well, Vescry himself came back to Holt's exactly once that first week, on Thursday morning, alone. He sat at Ray's usual corner table with a cup of black coffee and a newspaper, and he didn't look at her any more than a regular customer would. Ray, displaced to the two-top by the window, glanced between them once and went back to his crossword. She refilled Vescari's coffee once without being asked. He thanked her without looking up. She went back to the kitchen. At 9:15, he left a 20 on the table and walked out. She picked it up, folded it, put it in the till. 14 months in a small town had taught her something that all the syndicate training hadn't. People read the small things, not the grand gestures, the small ones. A woman who pocketed the 20 would be noticed. A woman who left it on the table to make a point would be noticed differently. A woman who put it in the till like it was a 20 from anyone else was invisible. She needed to be invisible. She just wasn't sure anymore whether she was hiding from the right person. The drive-by happened on a Wednesday, the third week of November. She'd heard the shot before she processed that it was a shot, which was how it always worked. The body knew first, the hindbrain throwing her sideways and down behind the counter before the sound had fully decoded itself in her conscious mind. Glass from the front window came in a horizontal sheet. She was already low. Becca was screaming somewhere behind the pastry rack. A man, one of the morning regulars, a contractor named Walt, had been sitting at the center table and was now on the floor, his hand pressed to his upper arm, blood coming through his fingers in the bright particular way of arterial involvement. She was at him before she'd decided to move. "Move your hand," she said. "What?" "Move it." She didn't raise her voice. She took his wrist, displaced his hand, got her fingers over the wound and pressed with the heel of her palm. The blood was dark, which meant she'd been wrong. Vein, not artery. Still bad. Still needed pressure. She looked at Becca. "First aid kit, left cabinet under the sink. Now." Becca stared at her. "Becca." Still even. "Kit, under the sink. Go." Becca went. Walt was looking at her hands on his arm with the specific expression of a man who had expected competence to arrive in a uniform and instead got a woman in a flour-dusted apron. "I was a nurse," Nadine said, because she needed to say something, and it was close enough to something that had once been true in a way she couldn't explain. She had the wound packed and held before she heard the SUVs, which was how she knew Viscari's people had been watching the building. Response time like that didn't come from the station house. The sheriff's office was 6 blocks away. She didn't look up when Boots came through the doorway. She was aware of Viscari crouching beside her, not touching, just close. She could feel the specific quality of his attention the way you felt heat from something that wasn't on fire yet. "Ambulance is 3 minutes," he said. It was directed at her, not at Walt. "He'll keep," she said. "Venous bleed, not deep. Keep pressure until they get here." She stood, wiped her hands on her apron. He was watching her with something that wasn't surprise. It was past surprise into something more considered and more dangerous. She looked back at him. Steady. "I'll need to file a police report," she said. "Does the sheriff know about the shooting, or do you want me to call directly?" A beat passed between them. "Sheriff's already been notified," he said. She nodded. Went to the kitchen to get the first aid kit's remaining gauze before Becca used it wrong. She heard him behind her, not following, just present in the space. She didn't know what he was going to do with what he'd just seen. She'd moved too fast, too clean, too sure. A bakery employee with 14 months of mountain town life did not move through an active shooting incident like that. She'd known that while she was doing it, and she'd done it anyway, because Walt was bleeding and she couldn't watch that and stay still. That had always been her problem. She could do everything else right. She just couldn't watch someone bleed and stay still. She heard Viscari walk back out to the main room. She stood in the kitchen and breathed for 10 full seconds. Outside, the town was starting to make the sounds towns made after violence. Voices rising, footsteps converging, someone's car alarm going off half a block away from the shot trajectory. She heard the ambulance before she finished breathing. She picked up the gauze and went back in. Walt was sitting up, pale, but sitting. Becca was beside him, holding his hand, her phone in her other hand already recording video, because Becca was 23 and that was what 23 did. Nadine sat beside Walt and said nothing to either of them. She watched Vescari through the broken window as he stood in the street, talking to two of his men. His back was to her. His shoulders were level. Whatever had just happened, whatever that shooting was connected to, it hadn't surprised him the way it should have surprised a real estate investor. A real estate investor would have been shaken. He was operational. She felt the specific cold clarity that came when something she'd hoped was wrong turned out to be exactly right. He hadn't come to Ashridge for the property. She didn't know yet what he'd come for, but for the first time in 14 months, she was afraid it might not be her. And somehow, that was worse. The ambulance arrived. The paramedics took Walt. The sheriff arrived 4 minutes after that. Not 3, not 2, 4, which was wrong for 6 blocks. And asked her questions she answered in the flat, careful way of someone who had answered police questions many times and knew exactly where the edges were. She went home at 2 p.m. when Becca finally agreed to close early. She sat on her bed and didn't move for a long time. Then she got up, pulled the go bag from the wall, opened it, verified the contents, and set it on the floor beside the bed where she could reach it in the dark. She didn't pack it, not yet, but she stopped pretending she wouldn't need it. The go bag sat on the floor beside her bed for 6 days before she touched it again. Not because the threat had passed, because moving it would mean admitting something she wasn't ready to admit, that Ashridge was already over, that the 14 months she'd spent building Claire Novak out of nothing had an expiration date stamped on them the morning 3 black SUVs rolled into the parking lot of a bakery that no longer belonged to Margaret Holt. She went to work. She kept the routine. That was what you did. That was the discipline. Panic was visible. Routine was invisible. She was very good at invisible. The sheriff came by on Thursday. His name was Dale Pruitt, mid-50s, the kind of heaviness that collected around a man over years of desk work and poor sleep, a face that had been friendly once and had settled into something more careful. He'd been sheriff of Ashridge for 11 years. People trusted him the way small towns trusted fixtures. He'd coached youth baseball. He organized the 4th of July road closure. He knew everybody's name and most of their business, and he wore that knowledge lightly, the way men did when they'd had a long time to get comfortable with how much they knew. He sat at the counter with coffee and asked her the same questions from the week before, phrased slightly differently. She gave him the same answers, slightly rephrased. That was how these conversations worked. He was looking for variance. She didn't give him any. "Walt's doing well," Pruitt said. "Arm's going to be fine." "I'm glad," she said. She meant it. He turned the coffee mug in a slow half circle, watching it. "You handled that real well. The first aid." "Basic training," she said. "Did a wilderness first responder course a few years back. Force of habit." He looked up at her then. Not suspicious. Something gentler than that. Curious in the way of a man who collected small inconsistencies and filed them away for later without necessarily acting on them. "Huh," he said. She refilled his coffee without being asked. He thanked her and left a good tip and didn't come back that day. She watched him cross the square and felt the specific unease of someone who had just been measured by a careful man and didn't know what number he'd come up with. What? Vescari was in the bakery 3 mornings out of the next 5. He never sat at the same table twice. He ordered coffee, sometimes a pastry, and he read a newspaper or looked at his phone with the focused air of someone with actual work to do. He didn't speak to her beyond the transaction. He didn't look at her longer than necessary. He tipped evenly, every time. She cataloged all of it and told herself it was threat assessment and mostly believed that. On the 5th morning, a Tuesday, cold enough that the walk-in felt almost warm by comparison, he was the only person in the bakery when she brought out the first tray of the day at 6 a.m. He was at the far table, newspaper open, coffee already in hand, which meant someone had let him in before she'd noticed. That bothered her more than anything else so far. She put the tray down on the counter and said, without turning around, "How'd you get in?" "Door was unlocked." "I checked it at 5:40. "Maybe you didn't check it well enough." She turned around. He was reading the paper. He hadn't looked up. "I check it every morning," she said. "I check it the same way. I don't miss it." He turned a page. "Then someone unlocked it after you." The space between those words and the next thing either of them said lasted about 4 seconds and held a substantial amount of information. She pulled her expression flat. I'll get a new lock. Good idea, he said, like they were talking about something that didn't matter. She went back to the kitchen, stood with her hands on the edge of the prep counter, and breathed 3 times through her nose. She was not imagining it. He had just told her in the cleanest possible language that his people could access this building whenever they chose, and he wanted her to know that. Not a threat. A fact. There was a difference, and she understood it. She went back out and poured herself coffee and stood at the counter like she always did before the morning crowd arrived. Mr. Viscari, she said. He looked up. What are you doing in Ashridge? He folded the paper, set it down. Looked at her with the same careful quality he'd had from the first day. The assessment, the gap between stimulus and response that marked someone who had trained themselves out of reacting automatically. Real estate, he said. You paid 4 times market value for the Miners' Lodge, she said. It hasn't been operational in 6 years. The foundation has water damage. There's a lien against it from 2018. Something shifted in the corner of his mouth. Not a smile. The ghost of something that had been thinking about becoming one. You looked into it, he said. I live here, she said. People talk. People do, he agreed. She held his gaze. That's not a real estate play. He picked up his coffee. You're very observant for a bakery employee. I'm observant for a person, she said. What do you want? He looked at her for a long time, long enough that she felt the strain of it, the effort of keeping her face still when every trained instinct was telling her to move, to create distance, to do something. Good coffee, he said finally, and stood up and walked out. She stared at the door for 10 seconds after it closed. Then she took his cup to the sink and washed it with more force than necessary. Halt. The men she hadn't cataloged started showing up on the 8th day. These were different from the renovation crew. The renovation men had the right kind of dirt on them. The particular combination of sawdust, joint compound, and cold weather exhaust that came from people actually working. These new ones were cleaner. They arrived in a white panel van with a legitimate-looking plumbing logo on the side and spread out through the square in a way that was almost perfectly natural. Almost. She spotted the first one because of his shoes. You could change everything about your appearance, dress down, dirty up, but shoes were the last thing people changed because shoes were expensive and most people only had a few pairs. His were wrong, too new, the wrong sole wear pattern for someone who'd been working trades in cold weather. She spotted the second because he took the same route past the bakery window twice in 40 minutes and took it on the inner edge of the sidewalk both times, which was the path you took when you wanted a clear view of an interior through glass. She didn't look directly at either of them. She counted 4 total by noon and kept the number in her head and went home at her usual time and walked the neighbor's dog her usual route. On the way back, she took a left instead of a right at the corner of Birch and 4th. There was a black SUV parked outside the hardware store where she lived. She walked past it without breaking stride. Went around the block, came back from the opposite direction. The SUV was still there. Someone inside. Driver's seat, engine off. No condensation on the windows despite the cold, which meant either the car was new enough to have seat heating or the man inside had been there long enough for the glass to equalize. She went in through the back entrance. She did not touch the go bag. She sat on the bed and thought about what it meant that surveillance had moved from the town square to her building. It meant someone had made a decision. She didn't know yet who had made it. She found out part of the answer 2 days later, and it came from Becca. Becca, who talked constantly, who posted everything, who had 1,700 followers on a platform Nadine had never used. Becca, who was 23 and sharp in ways she didn't know were sharp. It was a slow morning, barely anyone in, and Becca was leaning on the counter between tasks with her phone and saying something about the new people in town, the ones working on the Miners' Lodge, because she'd gone out on Saturday with some of the girls from the diner, and apparently 2 of the renovation guys had shown up at the same bar. They were nice, Becca said. Like, not creepy or anything, but weird. Nadine was filling the display case. Weird how? Like? Becca tilted her head, reaching for the language. They didn't drink. Like they ordered stuff and held it, and then didn't drink it. And they were watching the door the whole time, not in a paranoid way, in a practiced way? Like it was just what their eyes did. Nadine set a tray of scones down without looking at her. Maybe they're AA, Both of them, and they were talking to each other really quiet even though the bar was loud. Becca paused. One of them asked me where you lived. The scone tray stopped moving. Which one? Nadine said. The taller one. He was nice about it, just said he thought he knew you from somewhere and wanted to say hi. Becca looked at her directly for the first time in the conversation. I didn't tell him. Nadine looked up. Becca's face was clear and slightly serious in a way that was older than usual. I didn't tell him, she repeated. I don't tell people where my coworkers live. I don't do that. Good, Nadine said. Her voice came out more even than she expected. Should I be worried? Becca said. She considered the honest answer. Then she considered Becca's face, 23, and still capable of something close to uncomplicated concern, and she put the honest answer away. No, she said. Just let me know if he comes back. Becca nodded slowly in the way of someone who absolutely would keep that promise and absolutely was worried. Nadine went to the kitchen. She stood there and felt something cold move through her chest that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite anger, but lived in the territory between them. Becca hadn't told. One small thing. One person in this town had done exactly the right thing without being asked and without fully understanding why. It wouldn't be enough, but it was something. About him. She went to Viscari. She didn't decide to do it so much as she ran out of other options at around 9 p.m. on a Wednesday and stood at the edge of the decision for 20 minutes before she crossed it. She put on her coat and walked to the miners' lodge and knocked on the side door, which she'd identified as the working entrance 2 weeks earlier. The man who opened it was the one who'd been inside the bakery that first morning, standing by the door. He looked at her without expression. I need to talk to him, she said. He'll want to know I'm here, she said. Tell him it's Claire. The man held her gaze for 3 seconds. Then he stepped back and closed the door partially, and she heard low voices, and then the door opened again. Come in, he said. The interior of the miners' lodge was more functional than she'd expected. Not comfortable, but clean, with the particular organized spareness of a space that was operational rather than lived in. Folding tables, laptops, whiteboards covered in notation she couldn't read quickly enough without appearing to read it. She kept her eyes moving the way she always did, cataloging without staring. Viscari came through a door at the back. He was in a dark pullover and dark trousers, no jacket, and he had the slightly compressed look of a man who had been doing something that required concentration and hadn't finished it. He looked at her, then at the man by the door. Out, he said. The man left. Viscari sat on the edge of a folding table and crossed his arms and looked at her the same way he always looked at her. That flat assessment, patient, whatever was underneath it, kept well below the surface. Your people asked my coworker where I lived, she said. I know, he said. Call them off. They're not watching you, he said. They're watching the building. Why? He considered her for a moment. Because someone else is also watching it. The sentence landed with a specific weight. She let it settle. Who? She said. That's what I'm trying to establish. She studied his face. He wasn't performing. She had a specific talent for recognizing performance, for seeing the gap between what a face was doing and what the thoughts behind it were actually running, and she couldn't find that gap on him right now. You're not here for real estate, she said. No. Then what are you here for? He looked at her for a long time. There's a man, he said, who stole a significant amount of money from a significant number of people. Some of those people asked me to find out where he is. Her heart was doing something specific and controlled in her chest. She kept her breathing even. What does that have to do with Ashridge? She said. The trail ended here, he said, or close to here. She held his gaze. The trail to the man? The trail to someone who knows where the man is, he said. There it was. She'd known it was coming. She'd known since the first morning that the timing was too precise. Viscari and Ashridge at this specific moment, in this specific town where she'd been quiet and careful for 14 months. But knowing something is coming and having it arrive were two different weights. That's not me, she said. I didn't say it was. You implied it. I implied someone in Ashridge has information, he said. I didn't say who. She should have left. She knew that. Every trained instinct told her to say nothing further and walk out and go back to the apartment and make a decision about the go bag. Instead, she said the things she shouldn't have said because it had been 14 months since she'd talked to someone who understood the language she was actually speaking. "What's his name?" she said. "The man you're looking for." Viscari looked at her steadily. Atlas Kane. The name hit her in the solar plexus. She kept her face exactly where it was. "Never heard of him," she said. "Okay," he said. Just that. No push, no tell, no flicker of disbelief, just the word, flat and patient, from a man who had infinite time and knew it. She walked out. She walked the long way back to her building, circling 2 extra blocks, watching the periphery. The black SUV was gone. Something else had taken its place. A silver pickup she didn't recognize, parked at the far end of the block with someone in the passenger seat and the engine off. Not his people. The shoes had been wrong on his people, and these people would have different tells, and she didn't know them yet. She went inside, locked the door, put the chain on, sat on the bed, and pressed both hands flat against her knees and thought about what it meant that Atlas Kane had become visible in the same window of time that Damien Viscari had arrived in Ashridge, and what the possible intersection of those 2 facts was, and how many of those intersections put her in the center. All of them. Every version of the math put her in the center. She had 3 days of almost normal before the informant showed himself. It was Jerry Tipton, and she would not have guessed it in 100 years. Jerry was 61, worked the loading dock at the feed store at the edge of town, and came into the bakery every Friday morning for a sausage biscuit and a large drip coffee, and he'd been doing it since before Nadine arrived. He was a fixture. He was background. He was exactly the kind of person you stopped seeing because they were so reliably present. She'd only figured it out because of a phone. He'd been in on the Friday after her visit to Viscari, and he'd been at the counter, and his phone had buzzed, and he'd looked at it in a way that was wrong. Not the ordinary glance of a man checking a message. The fast, tense, particular attention of someone reading something they'd been waiting for and were anxious about. He'd seen her see it, which she only knew because his eyes had come up fast to check her face. She'd given him nothing, but she'd started watching him differently. On Tuesday, she'd seen him on the east side of the square, talking to the man with the wrong shoes. Not a long conversation. 40 seconds. He'd passed something. She couldn't see what, too much distance, and the man with the wrong shoes had walked away without acknowledging the exchange. Dead drop, clean, fast. Jerry Tipton, who had a sausage biscuit every Friday and lived in the same house for 32 years, and whose wife worked at the library, was feeding information to someone. She sat with that for a full day before she decided what to do about it. She didn't tell Viscari. She didn't tell Pruitt. She did the thing that was hardest, which was nothing. She let it sit and watched and waited to see what Jerry was actually feeding them, because the value wasn't in exposing the leak. The value was in controlling what moved through it. That required patience she didn't have. She practiced it anyway. The answer came Thursday, 4 days before the bakery burned. She was closing up just past 3 p.m. when she heard the raised voices from the alley that ran along the building's north side. Not unusual. The alley fed into the delivery area for 3 businesses, and things occasionally got loud. But these voices had the specific compressed tension of men who were angry at each other about something specific, not the loose anger of a dispute over a parking spot. She moved to the narrow window at the back of the kitchen. 2 men. She recognized one, from Viscari's crew, one of the ones she'd tagged as a senior member by the way the others deferred to him physically. She didn't recognize the other. That meant he was new. New in a context like this was always the riskier variable. She couldn't hear the words. She could hear the rhythm and texture of the exchange, and it was the rhythm of threat. Short sentences, long pauses, the kind of silences that men let run when they wanted the other person to feel the weight of what hadn't been said yet. Then the new man did something she'd seen once before, years ago, in a parking garage in Chicago, right before something very bad happened. He touched his left hip. Not dramatically, not even consciously, probably. Just a small weight shift and a fractional contact with the side of his jacket, the automatic gesture of a person checking that the thing they might need was still where it was supposed to be. She was at the back door before she'd made a decision. She came out into the alley at a pace that was not quite hurrying and said, "Hey, we've got a delivery issue. Can you come look at this?" Directing it at Viscari's man without looking at the other one, her voice pitched exactly at the natural register of a harried bakery employee. The tension broke. The new man stepped back. Viscari's man looked at her for 1 second with an expression that said he knew exactly what she'd just done, and then he said, "Sure," and followed her inside. She let the door close behind them. He stood in the kitchen and looked at her. She looked back. "He's new," she said, keeping her voice low. 4 days, the man confirmed. His name was Reyes. She'd caught it in passing during a conversation she shouldn't have been close enough to hear. He was 30-something, compact, the kind of careful that came from experience rather than training. "He's not yours," she said. "No." "He was checking his weapon." "I know." Reyes's jaw moved slightly. "I was handling it." "You were running out of room to handle it," she said. "Another 30 seconds and someone in that alley was going to make a decision you couldn't unmake." He looked at her for a long time. "You see a lot." "Occupational hazard," she said, because she needed to say something and it was the most deflectable truth she had. Reyes nodded slowly. Then he said, "He's asking about a woman who used to work for Kane. He has a description." Her lungs did something very specific and very quiet. "What kind of description?" she said. "Height, build, Northwestern MBA. He paused. "He doesn't have a name yet." She stood in the kitchen of Holt's Bakery and felt 14 months of careful, deliberate invisibility develop a crack she could not repair. "How long before he has a name?" she said. "If Jerry Tipton is what I think he is," Reyes said, 3 days. Maybe 2. She looked at the prep counter, at the flour residue still on the surface from the morning, at the crack in the tile she'd been meaning to mention to someone for 3 months. She thought about the go bag on the floor beside her bed. She thought about Becca, who hadn't told anyone where she lived. She thought about Walt, who had let her press her hands over a wound without asking why she knew how. She thought about Ray at his corner table, watching the room the way men did when they'd spent a long time watching rooms. "Thank you," she said. Reyes walked back out to the alley without another word. She stood in the kitchen for a long time. Then she took off her apron, folded it over the rack, and walked to the back door. She had 2 days, maybe 3, before someone handed Atlas Kane a name, and Atlas Kane would recognize it instantly, and every resource he'd kept in reserve for the single specific purpose of finding her would be redirected to a mountain town in Virginia with 1 road in and 1 road out. She had 2 days, and she was done pretending that the go bag was a precaution. She packed the go bag in 11 minutes. Not because she was panicking, because she'd rehearsed it enough times in her head that her hands knew the sequence without being told. Documents first, then the cash in the waterproof sleeve, then the change of clothes rolled tight, the burner phone still in its original packaging, the small med kit, the folding knife she'd bought at a hardware store in Tennessee 14 months ago and never used. She'd practiced this in her mind every few weeks the way other people ran through fire escape routes, not expecting to need it, just making sure the path was clear. She set the bag by the door. Then she sat on the edge of the bed and didn't move for 4 minutes. This was the part she hadn't rehearsed, the part after the bag was packed, and before she actually left, where the full weight of what leaving meant pressed down on everything. The apartment, the flower smell she'd carried home in her hair so many mornings, it had become part of the place. The neighbor's dog she walked on Tuesdays and Thursdays, Becca's voice filling the bakery like furniture. 14 months of constructed ordinary life, and she was about to walk away from it the same way she'd walked away from the one before. She thought about the name Reyes had said. Northwestern MBA. Kane knew that much. Which meant someone in the original syndicate structure had talked, or Kane had reconstructed her background from the financial records she'd touched, which he would have been methodical enough to do. She'd always known he was methodical. That had been the thing about him. Not the violence, not the scale of what he'd taken, but the patience of it. The way he moved through information, the way water moved through stone. Slow, relentless. Eventually through. She stood up, put on her coat, picked up the bag. Then her phone buzzed. Not the burner. The regular one. The Claire Novak one she used for local things. Grocery pickup, the library's overdue notice system, Becca's occasional texts about schedule changes. She looked at the screen. It was a number she didn't recognize. Local area code. The text was 4 words. Don't leave tonight, please. She stood in her coat with the bag on her shoulder and stared at the screen for a long time. Then she put the phone in her pocket, kept the bag on her shoulder, and walked out anyway. She got as far as the end of the block. The silver pickup from 2 nights ago was parked at the corner, and the man in the passenger seat was looking directly at her, not trying to hide it, wanting her to see him. She stopped. He was 40, maybe. Broad through the chest, military posture without the military haircut, the specific kind of stillness she associated with people who had been trained to wait and had spent a long time getting very good at it. He held her gaze without expression. She looked left, looked right. A second man was standing at the far end of the block, near the hardware store entrance. She hadn't seen him 30 seconds ago. She stood between them and felt the geometry of the situation settle around her like concrete. She went back inside. She sat at her kitchen table with the go bag on the floor beside her and the regular phone on the table in front of her, and waited. At 11:40 p.m., there was a knock at her door. 3 knocks, measured, not urgent. She'd already checked the window. Reyes, alone, hands visible. She opened the door. He came in without being invited, checked the window himself out of habit, and sat in the one chair she had at the table like he'd been there before. "You can't run tonight," he said. "I noticed," she said. "Those your people?" "No." The word landed flat. She looked at him. "Kane moved faster than we thought," Reyes said. "He had a secondary team here already, separate from the one we'd been tracking. They came in 3 days ago in a moving company truck." He paused. "They have the exits. Both roads, the trail access at the North Ridge, the fire road behind the feed store." She absorbed that. "How many?" "We've confirmed 6. Could be 8. She looked at the table. "He knows I'm here." "As of approximately 6 hours ago," Reyes said. Tipton made contact. She'd known it was Tipton. She'd known since Tuesday. Knowing it and having it confirmed were still different weights, and she felt both of them. "What does Viscari want to do?" she said. Reyes looked at her with an expression that was the closest thing to uncomfortable she'd seen on him. "He wants to talk to you." "We've talked." "He wants to talk to you about what you actually are," Reyes said. "Not what you told him you are." She looked at her hands on the table, turned them over, turned them back. "Tonight?" she said. "Now," he said. Machise. The Miners' Lodge was different at midnight. The daytime operational texture, laptops, activity, the low noise of men working, had been replaced by something quieter and more compressed. Fewer people, brighter light in the back room, the particular quality of a space where a decision was being made. Viscari was at the table in the rear, not the folding table this time, a real one, solid, the kind the lodge had probably had since the 80s. He had a map open on it, which he closed when she came in. That was interesting, not because he was hiding it from her, but because the act of closing it was deliberate, like he was setting the parameters. You can see this much, not more yet. He looked at her for a moment, then he said, "Sit down." She sat. He stayed standing, which she noted. "Nadine," he said. The name. Her real name. Out of his mouth in this room. She felt it land in her chest like a stone dropped in still water. The ripple of it went outward, and she kept her face still over the top of it. "When?" she said. 3 days after I arrived, he said. "Your financials. The routing structures you built for Harlan Group between 2019 and 2021 had a specific architecture. Nobody else builds them that way. The redundancy pattern is distinctive. I've seen your work before. I just didn't know the name that went with it." She thought about 2 years of her life distilled into a routing structure distinctive enough to be recognized like a signature. "What do you want?" she said. "The ledger," he said. There it was, clean and direct, no preamble. She respected it even as it hollowed something out in her. "There is no—" "Don't," he said. Not loud, just a single word with all the patience taken out of it. "I've been in this business for 23 years. I know when someone is about to tell me something doesn't exist that exists. Don't do that. It wastes time, and you don't have time. She looked at the table, at the grain of the wood, at the coffee ring from someone's mug that hadn't been wiped up. The ledger documents everything, she said. Every account, every bribery arrangement, I know what it documents, he said. I need to know where it is. She looked up at him. Why should I tell you that? He pulled the chair across from her, turned it around, and sat with his arms across the back of it. This close, in this light, she could see what the other distances had softened. A scar along his jaw that had been a serious injury once, the particular tightness around his eyes of someone who had been running on short sleep for a long time, the fact that his hands on the back of the chair were not entirely steady. That was new. Vescari not entirely steady. Because Kane has 6 men on the exits and more coming, he said, and you have a bag packed and nowhere to go with it. And whatever you've been protecting for 3 years, protecting it alone hasn't worked. She said nothing. You split the key, he said. She looked at him. Kane's been looking for it for 3 years, Vescari said. He hasn't found it. The only way that's possible is if it doesn't exist as a single recoverable thing. It's divided, and the pieces are separated, and you're the only one who knows where all 3 are. He paused. That's not a guess. That's what 3 years of his search pattern implies to someone who's been watching it. She thought about the night she'd done it, a motel in Kentucky, 48 hours after Chicago. Her hands not shaking because she'd needed them not to shake, and she'd made them obey. The mathematical precision of dividing a 256-bit encryption key into 3 components that were individually useless. The specific locations she'd chosen for each piece, not together, not in order, each one requiring a separate journey to retrieve. She'd been so sure it was the right move. She was less sure now, sitting across from a man who'd reconstructed the logic of it from the outside. Even if that were true, she said carefully, giving you access to that ledger isn't exactly... I don't want access to it, he said. I want Kane. She stopped. The ledger destroys him, Vescari said. Every alliance he's maintained is built on the other parties believing he still has leverage over them. The moment those accounts go public, not to law enforcement, not to a single receiver who could suppress it, the moment they go to every party simultaneously, his leverage is gone. And a man with no leverage and a lot of enemies does not have a long future. She looked at him for a long time. That's the plan, she said, not extract the money. I don't need his money, Vescari said. I need him finished. She thought about that, about what it meant that a man with Vescari's resources wanted Kane finished rather than paid, about the specific kind of damage Kane had done to specific people for Vescari to be sitting in an abandoned mountain lodge at midnight making this argument. She almost asked. She didn't, because some information was more dangerous to have than to lack. There are 3 pieces, she said. They're not in Ashridge. I know. Retrieving them means moving through open territory. Kane's people will be watching the logical routes. I have people who know how to move. The routes aren't logical, she said. That's the point. I didn't put them in logical places. Something in his expression shifted. Not surprise. Something that might have been the beginning of a specific kind of respect. Then you'll have to come, he said. She should have said no. She thought about it, ran it out in her mind, the version where she said no, where she held the cards tight the way she'd been holding them for 3 years, where she maintained the only leverage she had by being the only person who knew the full picture. That version had worked for 3 years. It had gotten her to Ashridge. It had given her 14 months of cinnamon rolls and flour on her hands and a dog to walk on Tuesdays. It had also gotten her to midnight in a failing lodge with Kane's men on the exits and a packed bag she couldn't use. Okay, she said. Well, the bakery burned 4 nights later and she wasn't supposed to be inside it. The plan had been clean, or as clean as anything got in the company of people who made their living in the space between law and violence. They would move on the first piece in 2 days, use that time to establish a cleaner exit from Ashridge, and keep the visible routine intact so Kane's surveillance saw what it expected to see. But Becca had called at 11 p.m. on a Thursday to say she'd left the walk-in unlocked, and she was 3 counties away at her cousin's, and could Nadine just swing by and check it because the compressor had been acting up and the morning inventory was all in there. She should have said no to that too. She went. She let herself in through the side door, the new lock Vescari's people had installed. Better than what she'd managed herself, 3-point deadbolt, the works. And she went to the walk-in and checked the compressor, and it was fine. Becca had just not pushed the door all the way. She reset it. She stood in the dark kitchen that smelled of the day's baking, the ghost of brown butter and cardamom still present even at this hour. She let herself stand there for 10 seconds. Allowed it. The particular ache of a place you'd made ordinary being taken from you. She was at the side door when she heard the first sound from the alley. Not footsteps, not voices. A specific sound she recognized from training she'd received from people who were very serious about it. The click hiss of an accelerant canister being opened. She moved. She hit the door and came out into the alley at a run, and had already processed the man with the canister and the man behind him, and the third figure at the far end covering the main entrance before her body had finished making the decision to run. She cut left toward the gap between the bakery and the hardware supply next door, 18 inches wide, tight enough that anyone following had to go single file. The shot hit the door frame where she'd been standing. Suppressed? She felt the air displacement more than she heard it, which told her they'd been planning this as a contained operation. Suppress the witness, set the fire, be gone before the volunteer fire department responded. She made it through the gap and into the rear alley behind the block, and she was already running when she realized she was running toward someone. The impact was controlled. Not a collision, but an interception, a man's weight coming around her momentum and redirecting it instead of stopping it. Her training fired before her recognition did, and she had her elbow up and her weight shifted, and she would have connected with his throat if his hands hadn't already caught her arms. "It's me," Vescari said. She stopped. He was breathing hard, which meant he'd run to get here, which meant he'd been close enough to get here in time, which meant he'd been watching the bakery himself tonight. She processed that later. Right now there was a man with a suppressed weapon somewhere behind her. "How many?" he said. 3 in the alley, maybe more on the main street. He said something into a radio she hadn't seen. Then he pulled her sideways into the shadow of a loading dock overhang, and they stood pressed back against the metal door and waited. 12 seconds of silence. Then she heard it, the low crack whump of the fire catching, and the orange light began to move across the far end of the alley, and Holt's bakery started to burn. She watched it. She didn't look away. She made herself watch it because looking away was something you did with things you couldn't afford to know fully, and she had spent 3 years not being able to afford things, and she was done with that. The light grew. It was beautiful in the specific, terrible way fire always was. Then the second shot came, and it wasn't suppressed, and it wasn't aimed at her, it was aimed at Vescari. She heard it hit. The particular sound of impact that no one who'd heard it once ever forgot, and felt his weight shift against her and drop, and she went down with him without thinking, taking his weight, her hands already moving to find the wound. Upper left shoulder. Exit wound, which was the first good piece of information she'd had in 4 days. She pressed both hands over it. He was breathing, fast and tight and controlled, a man managing pain through discipline. "How bad?" he said. Not a question. An assessment request. "Through and through," she said. "You're not dying tonight." Reassuring. "Shut up," she said, because she needed him to shut up so she could think. She looked at the alley. The shooter had been elevated. Second floor, probably the window of the vacant diner across the square. That was a planned position. That was someone who'd been in place before she'd arrived, before the fire started. That was someone who'd known where Vescari would be tonight. That was inside information. She looked at his face. He was gray around the eyes, but present, his gaze moving even through the pain, checking the alley, checking the angles, the reflex of a man who'd been in bad situations long enough that it was involuntary. "Your man Reyes," she said. "Where is he tonight?" Vescari's eyes came back to her face. He looked at her for 1 second, and in that second something moved across his expression. Not suspicion, something older and more specific than that. The particular look of a man who had just had a thought he desperately did not want to be having. He was supposed to be on the north perimeter, he said. Is he? Viscari reached for the radio with his good arm, said a call sign twice. Got silence. He said it again. Silence. She looked at him. He looked at her. The fire behind them was making the alley bright as daylight now, orange and shifting, and in that light she could see him working through it. Reyes, who had told her about Tipton, who had known the exit routes, who had been inside the operational planning from the beginning. Reyes, who had come to her apartment, who had known exactly what she'd been about to do. He told me not to run that night, she said. He knew which direction I'd go. Viscari's jaw set. He said nothing. He told me Kane had the exits covered, she said, which meant Kane knew the exits, which means someone told Kane the exits. She watched him absorb it, watched the specific controlled way a man took in information that reorganized his understanding of the last several weeks, and didn't let the damage show in his face because showing damage in the wrong moment was the kind of thing that got you killed. How long has he been with you? She said. 8 years, Viscari said. She said nothing. Some things didn't need commentary. Reyes's voice came through the radio then, finally, crackling, slightly breathless. Boss, we've got a situation on the north perimeter. Viscari looked at the radio, looked at her. She saw him make the decision in real time. She saw the exact moment he chose not to answer, put the radio down, and kept his eyes on her. The third piece, he said, the one farthest out. Where is it? She looked at the burning bakery, at the place that had been ordinary and warm and safe and was now none of those things. Western Pennsylvania, she said. Small town called Delver. There's a storage facility on the edge of town. Unit 114. She paused. I paid the year's rental in cash 18 months ago. The key is in the go bag. He nodded once. She became aware that she was still holding both hands over his wound, that they were pressed back against a loading dock with fire throwing light across the alley, that somewhere in this town Reyes was feeding information to the man who had spent 3 years looking for her, and that the plan she and Viscari had spent 4 days building had just been handed to the enemy in its entirety. She became aware of one more thing. She was not running. 3 years. Every crisis point, every moment the ground shifted, she had run. New name, new town, new version of invisible. And right now, with the exit option still technically present, with the chaos of the fire and Kane's teams and a blown operation providing the best cover she'd had in 3 years, she was sitting in an alley with her hands on a gunshot wound, and she was not running. She didn't fully understand that yet, but she felt it, the way you felt a change in altitude, a pressure difference, something that had been constant becoming something else, her body registering a shift that her mind hadn't caught up with. Reyes came around the far end of the alley 40 seconds later. He was moving fast, and his face had the right kind of alarm on it, the urgent, focused alarm of a man responding to a crisis. He was very good. She could see now, with the context that had been missing before, exactly how good he was. He pulled up when he saw them. His eyes went to Viscari's shoulder. What happened? Who? Shooter, Viscari said. Second floor, diner window, east facing. He held Reyes's gaze. You were on north perimeter. I was, Reyes said. There was movement on the trail access. I had to... Which trail access? Viscari said. A beat. Half a second. Nothing in Reyes's face changed. Fire road, he said. Behind the feed store. Viscari nodded slowly. The fire road, he said. Reyes looked between them, at Nadine's hands on Viscari's shoulder, at the blood. We need to get him out, Reyes said. I've got a vehicle. Whose vehicle? Nadine said. Reyes looked at her. Whose vehicle? She said again. Yours or one of the pool cars? Mine, he said. It's faster. She looked at Viscari. Viscari looked at Reyes for a long time, long enough that the fire made the only sound between them, the low, greedy crackling of a building being consumed. Then Viscari said, Nadine's gonna drive. Something crossed Reyes's face. So small, so fast, but she was watching for it and she caught it. The specific micro-expression of a man whose plan just encountered an obstacle he hadn't built in. Of course, Reyes said, and handed her the keys. She took them. Her fingers were still red with Viscari's blood. She helped Viscari to his feet, took his weight on her right side, and started moving toward the street. Reyes fell in behind them. She could feel him behind her, the proximity of him, the specific quality of attention from a man who was recalculating in real time. She kept walking, kept her pace steady, kept her shoulders from pulling. She had the keys to Reyes's car. She had Viscari upright and mobile. She had the knowledge of what Reyes was, which he didn't know she had yet. And she had the understanding, finally, fully, that running was no longer a strategy available to her. Not because the exits were covered, but because the thing she'd been running from for 3 years had followed her to the only place she'd tried to make a life, and burned it. And the only way out of that was through it. She walked toward the vehicle in the orange light of the burning bakery, and Reyes walked 3 steps behind her, and somewhere in this mountain town, Atlas Kane was receiving a report, and none of the pieces were where anyone thought they were except her, and she was the only one who knew that, and she held it the way she'd held everything for 3 years. Close, quiet, and completely alone, except that this time, for the first time, she wasn't planning to keep holding it alone. She unlocked the car, got Viscari into the passenger seat, walked around to the driver's side. Reyes reached for the rear door handle. "Stay," she said. He looked at her. "We need someone on the perimeter," she said. "You know this town. Stay." He held her eyes for 1 beat too long. Then he nodded and stepped back. She got in, started the engine, drove. In the mirror, she watched Reyes stand in the orange light until the road curved and took him from view. She drove for 20 minutes before Viscari passed out. Not dramatically. He didn't slump or jerk. He just went quiet in a way that was different from his regular quiet, and when she glanced over, his head was against the window, and his breathing had gone shallow and slow. She pulled over on a dark county road and checked the wound with the car's interior light and the flashlight on her phone. The bleeding had slowed. The exit wound was ugly, but not enlarging. He'd lost enough blood to drop him, but not enough to kill him if she was careful with the next few hours. She sat in the pulled-over car for 90 seconds and thought. Reyes would have made contact with Kane's people within 5 minutes of watching her drive away. He'd have given them the vehicle description. He'd handed her the keys himself. He'd memorized it. That was what people like Reyes did automatically. She had maybe 20 minutes on that, less if Kane had intercepted vehicles already positioned on the county routes. She needed to ditch the car. She needed to get Viscari stable. She needed to reach the first key piece before anyone else did, because Reyes had heard her tell Viscari about Delver and Unit 114, and the only question was whether he'd transmitted that before or after she'd left him standing in the orange light. She pulled back onto the road and drove. She was 30 miles outside Ashridge when she saw the first set of headlights following her pattern, 3 cars back, matching her speed on a road that had no reason for traffic at 1:15 a.m. She didn't speed up. She took the next left without signaling, killed her lights for the 50 yards to the next turn, took it, then took another, and came out on a parallel county route running north. The headlights didn't follow. Either she'd lost them, or they had another vehicle on the parallel route. She drove with the windows down despite the cold because the cold kept her sharp, and she needed sharp right now, not comfortable. Viscari made a sound at mile 32. Not words, just the low, involuntary sound of someone returning from somewhere unpleasant. "Stay with me," she said. "I'm here," he said. His voice was rough, stripped of its usual control. "How's the pain?" "Educational," he said. She almost smiled, almost. "I need you coherent. Reyes heard me tell you about Delver." A pause while he processed. "How long ago did you realize?" "The alley," she said. "When you couldn't raise him on the radio and then he came from the wrong direction." The wrong direction. North perimeter would have put him west of the alley. He came from the east. He was at the diner. She kept her eyes on the road. "He was the spotter for the shooter. He marked your position." She heard Viscari's breathing change. 8 years, he said, more to himself than to her. "People change their math," she said, "especially when someone offers them better numbers." He said nothing for a while. She could feel him working through it. Not the betrayal. He was past that already. She could tell by the quality of his silence. He was working through the operational damage, what Reyes knew, what Reyes had passed, what was compromised, and what could be salvaged. Delver, he said. He has it. He has the location, she said. He doesn't have the unit number. You said 114. I said 114 when Reyes was in earshot, she said. It's not 114. The silence that followed had a particular quality. What number is it? Viscari said. I'll tell you when we get there, she said. He made a sound that might have been a laugh if it hadn't also clearly hurt him. Fair, he said. But she found a motel 40 miles out, the kind that still took cash and didn't require a name beyond whatever you wrote on the card yourself. She wrote James and left it at that. She got Viscari inside and onto the bed and spent 20 minutes cleaning and repacking the wound with the med kit from her go bag, working by the bathroom light with the door cracked. He watched her hands work. You've done this before, he said. The wilderness first responder thing wasn't entirely fictional, she said. Mostly fictional. Who taught you? Someone who needed me to know how, she said. She tied off the bandage. You need to stay off this shoulder. The exit wound is clean, but you've got tissue damage, and if you torque it wrong, you'll reopen. I know how gunshot wounds work, he said. Then stop talking and rest. He looked at her for a moment. You left Reyes standing there because you didn't know if he'd already transmitted Delver. Yes. And if he had, going there still makes sense because the first piece is there, and we need it regardless. Yes. And you're telling me this now because you want me thinking clearly before we drive into whatever's waiting at a storage facility in western Pennsylvania. He paused. Where Kane's people may already be positioned. You needed to know the full picture, she said. You've been operating on partial information because I didn't trust you. She stopped. That's not workable anymore. He looked at her. His face was gray with pain and blood loss, and something else she didn't have a name for. The ledger, he said. When it broadcasts, it takes down Kane. It also takes down everyone connected to Kane's network. Yes, which includes several organizations I have existing arrangements with. She looked at him steadily. Yes, you knew that when you agreed to help me, he said. I knew it before I agreed, she said. I agreed anyway. He held her gaze for a long time. Then he lay back against the pillow and looked at the ceiling. Get some sleep, he said. 2 hours. I'll watch. You can barely sit up. I can sit up fine, he said. I just can't lift anything with my left arm. He looked at her. 2 hours, Nadine. You're no good to either of us running on nothing. She sat in the room's one chair and she did not sleep for the first 40 minutes. She watched him watch the door and thought about the specific series of decisions that had led to this particular motel room in this particular moment, and whether any of them had been wrong, and concluded that most of them had been wrong, but that the wrongness had been unavoidable, the kind that accrued when you made the only choice available to you repeatedly for 3 years. She slept for 70 minutes. When she woke, he was exactly where she'd left him, upright against the headboard, eyes on the door. Nothing, he said before she asked. She stood up, rolled her shoulders. The cold from the open window had settled into her joints. Delver is 4 hours, she said. We need to move. They reached the outskirts of Delver at 6:40 a.m. The town was small in the particular way of places that had once been larger. The bones of former industry visible in buildings that had changed use twice and would change again. A main street with half its storefronts occupied. A diner already open, its windows yellow and warm in the early dark. The storage facility was on the eastern edge, a quarter-mile past the last gas station. A low flat structure with chain link and a keypad gate, and one overnight security light that buzzed faintly in the stillness. She drove past it once without slowing. One vehicle in the lot, an older sedan, Virginia plates. Could be a unit renter who'd come early. Could be Kane's advance team. Could be nothing. She came around the block and parked on the parallel access road with the facility's east fence and sightline. One vehicle, she said. 2 people, maybe. Could be a single. Viscari was looking at the facility through the window. His color was better than it had been at 2 a.m. Not good, but functional. Gate access, he said. Keypad. I have the code. Cameras? 2 on the main drive, 1 covering the north side, dead angle on the southeast corner where the fence meets the building. She'd walked this in her memory so many times it was more real than some places she'd actually stood. We go through the southeast approach. And the unit, he said. The actual number. 47, she said. Southeast cluster. 3rd row. He nodded. She looked at him. You're going to wait in the car. You're going to wait in the car, she said again, the same even tone she used when a decision wasn't open.
But sometimes...
Because you have one functional arm, and I need to move fast, and I cannot move fast if I'm compensating for your left side. She met his eyes. This is the part I do alone. You know that. He looked like he wanted to argue. He had the face of a man who hadn't waited in a car for anything in a very long time. If you're not back in 20 minutes, he said. Give me 30, she said. Then call whoever you have left that isn't Reyes. She got out of the car. Dad. The southeast corner of the fence had a gap at the base she'd seen in the satellite image she'd studied 18 months ago in a library in Pittsburgh, and it was still there. The chain link pulled up 6 inches by something that might have been a deer or a dog or just ground shift over time. She went through flat on her stomach, gravel pressing into her hands, and came up in the dead angle of the camera. She moved along the building's edge in the early dark and gray light, her footsteps on the asphalt controlled and soft, her breathing measured through her nose. She found Unit 47 in 90 seconds. The padlock was hers, a specific brand she'd purchased in Pittsburgh under a name that didn't exist anymore. She had the key. She opened it without sound and slipped inside and pulled the door down behind her. The unit smelled of cold and dust and the particular dry smell of enclosed space. She went to the back wall. 3rd shelf from the bottom, behind a cardboard box labeled Kitchen that she'd filled with old magazines for weight. She moved the box, found the waterproof case she'd taped to the back of the shelf, pulled it free. Inside was a folded piece of paper with a 43-character alphanumeric sequence written in pencil. 1/3 of the master encryption key. She put it in her jacket's interior pocket, replaced the box. Left the unit exactly as she'd found it. She was back at the car in 18 minutes. Viscari looked at her. She patted her jacket. He let out a breath that was longer than his usual. 2 more, she said, and started the engine. I'm sick. The second piece was in a bus station locker in Columbus, Ohio. They drove through the morning with the radio off and the heat on, and stopped once for gas where she paid cash and bought 2 coffees and a road atlas because she didn't want GPS active and she was better with paper anyway. She changed his bandage in the gas station bathroom, both of them standing at the sink. He was steadier than he'd been. The wound wasn't infected yet, but it would need proper attention within 24 hours. Reyes will have told Kane about Delver by now, Viscari said. Yes. Kane will be trying to reconstruct the other locations. He won't be able to, she said. The locations weren't documented. They're in my head. He'll try to get them out of your head through other means, Viscari said. He'll use leverage. She taped the bandage down. What leverage does he have? Viscari looked at her in the mirror. Becca, he said. She's 23 and she's still in Ashridge, and Kane knows she matters to you because Reyes knows she matters to you. Her hand stopped. She'd thought about it. She'd pushed it down because thinking about it without being able to do anything about it was a specific kind of torture she couldn't afford right now. Hearing it said out loud made it real in a different way. She's at her cousin's, Nadine said. 3 counties out. Does Reyes know that? She didn't answer. Does Reyes know that? Viscari said again, flat and direct, making her answer. He might, she said. She took out the burner phone, turned it on for the first time, typed a number from memory, Becca's cousin's cell, which Becca had mentioned once in passing while Nadine hadn't appeared to be listening. It rang 4 times. Voicemail. She typed a text instead. This is Claire. Don't go back to Ashridge. Don't tell anyone where you are. Stay exactly where you are for 48 hours. I will explain later. Please. She stared at the sent message. Then she turned the burner off and took out the SIM and snapped it. She'll be safe if she stays put, Viscari said. She'll stay put, Nadine said. She's smarter than she looks. They got back in the car. Columbus was 3 hours out. They made it in 2:40 because she drove the way she drove when time had weight, and because the roads were clear and the sky had gone the flat white of an overcast morning that didn't promise anything good. The bus station was downtown, the old kind, high ceilings and worn terrazzo floors and the specific smell of transit hubs everywhere, food and exhaust, and the particular staleness of too many people passing through. She went in alone while Vescari stayed in the car, in the parking structure with a sight line to both entrances. Locker Bank D, Unit 23, key on the same ring as the storage unit key. She walked through the main hall and felt the space around her and read it the way she always read public spaces. Exits, camera positions, anyone whose stillness was too deliberate in a place defined by movement. She found one. He was near the east entrance, standing with a coffee cup facing the main hall, his eyes doing the slow, systematic sweep of someone with a specific subject in mind. She didn't recognize him from Ashridge. That meant Kane had moved additional resources in overnight, which meant Kane had known she'd be moving, which meant Reyes had given him not just Delver, but the operational read. She was collecting the key pieces. She was in transit. She had to come through the known corridors between locations. She turned before he completed his sweep to her section of the hall and went to the women's restroom, which had a single exit and was therefore a mistake tactically, but she needed 30 seconds to think. She stood at the sink, ran cold water over her wrists. There were two ways out of a watched space. The first was to not be recognized, but she'd been made in Ashridge, her description was in circulation, and if Reyes had added to it, she had nothing left to obscure. The second was to move through the watch point so fast the response couldn't coordinate. She went back out. She walked directly across the hall toward Locker Bank D, not fast, not slow. The pace of someone with a purpose and the right to be there. She watched the man near the east entrance in her peripheral vision. His coffee cup stopped moving. His eyes locked. His hand went to his jacket pocket. She had the locker open in 4 seconds. The waterproof case was there, so, smaller than the first, the same penciled sequence of characters, the second third of the key. She had it in her pocket and the locker shut in 7 seconds. He was already moving. She went left toward the west exit, which put the locker bank between her and him for the first 6 seconds of his pursuit. She heard him behind her, not running yet, trying to keep it contained, not wanting to create a scene that would bring transit security. She went through the west exit into the gray morning air and turned immediately right toward the parking structure. She heard him come through the door behind her. She heard him say something into a phone. She ran. She came into the parking structure at the ground level and took the stairs 2 at a time to the second floor and came out running toward the car, and Vescari had already seen her. She could tell from the engine sound he'd started it when she cleared the stairwell door. She got in. "Go," she said. He went. One arm, but he managed the wheel with a competence that cost him. She saw his jaw set against the pain of using the left arm to support on turns. The man came out of the stairwell as they cleared the exit barrier. She looked back once. He was on the phone, not running anymore. That was worse than running. Running was losing. Not running was relaying. "He made a call," she said. "They'll have the third location in their search pattern," Vescari said. "Where is it?" "Morgantown," she said. "West Virginia." "How long?" 3 hours, maybe less." She looked at his arm. "You're bleeding again." "I know," he said. "Pull over." "After the on-ramp," he said. "Now." "After the on-ramp, Nadine." She pressed her hand over his left shoulder from the passenger seat, holding pressure through the jacket, and felt the warmth of blood against her palm, and he drove with the one arm and took the on-ramp without slowing and merged onto the interstate, and then he said, "Okay." And she moved the car to the shoulder and they traded seats with the engine running. She pressed a fresh cloth from the kit against the wound. His face was tight and white around the mouth. "Tell me something," he said, "to keep my mind on something else." "What do you want to know?" "The night you divided the key," he said. "Kentucky. What made you think of it?" She looked at the road. "Mathematics," she said. "A key divided into 3 parts that are each useless alone is safer than a whole key hidden in one place. Because one place can be found. 3 separate places. 3 separate places require 3 separate failures," he said. "Or 3 pieces of information from the same source," she said, "which is what Reyes almost gave them." "Almost," Vescari said. "Almost," she said. She drove. He bled slowly and steadily through the fresh cloth and said nothing more. And she kept the speed exactly at the limit because speed cameras and patrol cars were the specific additional disaster she didn't have room for, and the sky stayed flat white and the road unspooled ahead of them, and she thought about Morgantown. The third piece was in a different kind of location, not a storage unit or a locker. She'd put it somewhere that required a specific kind of access she'd arranged 18 months ago and paid forward 2 years on, and the security around it was institutional rather than personal. And that was either going to be its advantage or its vulnerability, depending on how much Kane knew. She was about to find out which. Tee up. They reached Morgantown at 2:17 p.m., and the first thing she saw on the main approach road was a sedan parked at the intersection of the two routes into the University District, engine running, facing outward. She drove past it without slowing, checked the mirror. It pulled out. "Tail," she said. Biscari looked in the side mirror. "One car." "There'll be another," she said, "on the parallel route." "Where's the third piece?" he said. She looked at the university buildings through the windshield. "University library," she said. "Special collections. There's a sealed archival box registered under a research access account I created. The box is cataloged as personal papers. Dissertation research from a graduate student who doesn't exist." Biscari looked at her. "You put 1/3 of a criminal encryption key in a university library's special collections." "No one looks there," she said. "That's the point." "How do you get it out?" "I'm registered as an approved researcher on the access account," she said. "Claire Novak, Northwestern MBA. The ID holds as long as the database hasn't been updated." She paused. "If Reyes ran my credentials through Kane's network, the account may be flagged." "One way to find out," Biscari said. She looked at the tail in the mirror, looked at the university entrance ahead. "I can't bring you in," she said. "Two people entering a library archive together with a tail on them triggers every institutional security protocol." "I know," he said. "You're staying in the car again." "I figured," he said. He looked at her. "If the account is flagged and they're waiting inside, then I improvise," she said. "That's not a plan." "It's all I've got," she said. She pulled into the visitor lot and cut the engine. She looked at the tail. It had stopped half a block back, not pulling into the lot, trying to look ambient. "Give me your phone." He handed it over. She typed a number into it, a number she'd memorized 2 years ago and never used. "If I'm not out in 25 minutes, call that number," she said. "Say the name Harlan Group. Say it twice. That'll buy you exactly one conversation with someone who has resources. Use that conversation well." He looked at the number, then at her. "Who is that?" "Someone who owes me considerably more than a phone call," she said, "and who has enough of their own reasons to want Kane finished that they'll help." She got out of the car. She walked across the lot toward the library entrance and felt the tail's attention on her back, like a physical pressure. She did not look back. She went through the glass doors into the institutional hush of a university library and crossed the lobby toward the special collections desk. And as she approached, she read the face of the woman behind the desk and knew from the specific quality of that woman's stillness that someone had been there before her. She stopped at the desk. "Claire Novak," she said, "research access for the Harlan collection." The woman behind the desk looked at her computer screen, looked up. Her expression was careful and apologetic in the way of someone who'd been told what to say when a specific person arrived. "Ms. Novak," she said, "there's someone waiting for you in reading room B." She felt her heart do one hard, specific knock against her ribs. "Thank you," she said, and walked toward reading room B, and pushed open the door and found herself looking at Sheriff Dale Pruitt, sitting at the reading table with his hands folded and his hat on the table beside him, and beside him sat a man she had never seen before. And the man she had never seen before was looking at her with the particular proprietary attention of someone who had been looking for her for a very long time and had just found her. He was 53, silver-haired, the kind of face that would have been handsome once and had become something more interesting over years of doing damage. He was wearing a jacket that cost more than most cars. He had no visible security, which meant his security was already in the room, and she simply hadn't identified them yet. She had identified them, actually. The woman by the window who wasn't reading, The man near the secondary exit who was standing at the wrong angle to be browsing the shelves. Atlas Kane looked at her and said, in a voice that was almost warm, "You have something that belongs to me." And Dale Pruitt, who had coached youth baseball and organized the 4th of July road closure and known everybody's name, looked at the table and said nothing at all, and that silence was its own specific kind of confession. And she stood in the doorway of Reading Room B, with 2/3 of a broken encryption key in her jacket and the third piece 12 feet away inside a sealed archival box. And she understood that every move she'd planned for the last 72 hours had been anticipated, and that the only thing standing between her and the end of everything she'd built was whatever she decided to do in the next 4 seconds. 4 seconds. She counted them the way she'd learned to count them, not as time, but as space, each one a separate room she could move through or not. The woman by the window, the man near the secondary exit, Pruitt with his hands folded and his hat on the table, not looking at her, the specific shame of a man who'd made a calculation and was living inside the result of it. Kane, watching her with the patient attention of someone who had waited 3 years for this moment and found the waiting entirely reasonable. 4 seconds. She walked in and sat down. Kane's expression didn't change, but something in it adjusted. He'd expected something else. Flight, maybe? Or the particular frozen quality of someone whose options had just collapsed. She gave him neither. She pulled the chair across from him and sat in it with her hands on the table and looked at him the same way she'd looked at Viscari that first night in the miners' lodge. Direct, measuring, refusing to be the smaller person in the room. "You look tired," Kane said. "I've been driving," she said. "Where's Viscari?" "I don't know," she said. "We parted ways in Columbus." She watched his face process that. He didn't believe her. She could see that. But he filed it rather than challenged it, which meant he had people already looking and didn't need her answer to confirm. "The key," he said. "You have 2 pieces." "I have 2 pieces," she agreed. "You need all 3. "I need all 3, he said. "And you're going to give them to me." She looked at Pruitt. He was still looking at the table. The side of his face had the particular tight quality of a man who was holding himself together by concentrating on a fixed point. "Dale," she said. He looked up. His eyes were red around the rims in a way she hadn't expected. "How long?" she said. His jaw moved. 4 years, he said, "before you got here." "What did he give you?" "My daughter has—" He stopped, started again. "Medical debt. The kind that doesn't go away. He covered it, and then he owned me." She looked at him for a moment. She thought about the specific mathematics of that. A man who'd coached youth baseball and organized road closures, held in place for 4 years by a number on a hospital bill. Kane was very good at finding the exact weight that would hold a person down. "Does she know?" Nadine said. "No," Pruitt said, and the word came out stripped of everything but the raw fact of it. She looked back at Kane. "The 2 pieces I have won't reconstruct the key," she said. "You know that. You need all 3, assembled in the correct sequence by someone who knows the assembly architecture." She kept her voice even. "That's me. I'm the only one who can do it." "I know," Kane said. "So killing me here doesn't get you what you want." "No," he agreed. "It doesn't." He tilted his head slightly. "But the young woman in your apartment building, the one who walks the neighbor's dog on Tuesday and Thursday evenings, she's currently being collected by 2 of my people. And the girl from the bakery, the 23-year-old. He paused. "Her cousin's house in—" "Stop," Nadine said. He stopped. He waited. She sat with the weight of it. Becca's cousin's address. Reyes hadn't known the exact location, but Kane had resources she'd underestimated, and she'd been underestimating them for 3 years, and this was where that ended up. She thought about the phone in Viscari's hand, the number she'd typed. Say Harlan Group. Say it twice. She needed 8 minutes. "I'll assemble the key here," she said. "In this room. You and I, no one else. Your people stay outside." Kane studied her. "That's not—" "The assembly requires concentration and a clean environment," she said. "Standard security protocol for cryptographic reconstruction. You know that. You built the original system." She held his gaze. "Or did you forget the specifications you wrote?" That landed. She'd gambled on something she'd believed for 3 years. That Kane's professional vanity was the one crack in his architecture. The system he'd built for managing the ledger's encryption had been his design, his intellectual property in the most criminal sense, and he was constitutionally incapable of letting anyone suggest he'd forgotten how it worked. "Your people wait outside," she said. "Pruitt waits outside 15 minutes. He looked at her for a long time. 12, he said. 12, she said. He nodded once. Looked at the two people she'd identified, a small gesture, barely a motion of his hand, and they moved toward the exits. Pruitt stood slowly, the movement of a man whose joints had aged 10 years in the last hour, and walked out without looking at her again. The door closed. Kane and Nadine sat across from each other in the reading room of a university library, and for a moment the absurdity of it was almost physical. The institutional quiet, the shelved archival materials, the flat afternoon light through the high windows, and two people who had spent 3 years in a specific lethal geometry finally in the same room. She reached into her jacket and took out the 2 folded papers, set them on the table between them. He looked at them, but didn't reach for them. "The third piece," he said. "Archival box," she said. "I'll need to retrieve it. We'll retrieve it together." "The access is registered to my name," she said. "A second person in the retrieval process flags the system. University protocol." He watched her. "You're buying time," he said. "I'm explaining the architecture," she said. "You're doing both," he said. "And I'm letting you, because the outcome is the same regardless." He leaned back slightly. "There's nowhere for the time to go, Nadine. Whatever you think is coming, it isn't." She looked at him, at the face she'd studied in surveillance photographs and wiretap stills and the occasional press background. In person, he was smaller than those images suggested, not physically, but in the specific way that people who generated enormous fear were always smaller in person than in imagination. The fear was real, the damage was real, but the man was just a man, and he was sitting across from her in a library, and he was 53 years old, and he'd spent 3 years chasing a woman with flour on her hands, and she was still here. "Marcus Delvine," she said. Kane went very still. "He was your logistics coordinator before me," she said. "Chicago, 2017. He found the same irregularities I found, realized what the ledger actually documented, realized what it meant, tried to get out." She paused. "You told me he left voluntarily, relocated to Phoenix." Kane said nothing. "I looked for him," she said. "For 2 years, in between everything else. I looked because if he was alive, he was the one other person who understood the architecture." She put her hands flat on the table. "There's a storage unit in Phoenix, Unit 31, East Valley Self-Storage. I found it 14 months ago. I have pictures of what's in it decided on a drive that's not in this building, and copies of those pictures have been sent to 3 separate addresses that will open them automatically if they don't receive a specific code from me every 72 hours. The silence in the reading room was complete. "Marcus Delvine's remains," she said, "along with documentation connecting the cause of death to 2 men whose phone records show 47 contacts with your primary operations number in the 6 months preceding his disappearance. That's not leverage," she said. "That's a murder case. Federal. The kind that doesn't negotiate." Kane's face had gone through something during that. Not fear. She didn't think he was capable of fear in the ordinary sense. Something more structural. The expression of a man recalculating load-bearing walls. "You've been holding that for 14 months, he said. "Yes. And you didn't use it." "I was trying to stay invisible," she said. "Using it would have been visible." "What changed?" he said. "You burned my bakery," she said. He looked at her. Something moved in his eyes that was almost something human. A recognition, maybe, of the specific mistake he'd made when he'd chosen to apply pressure to something she'd built rather than the person herself. "The women you're holding," she said. "Release them. Both of them." "And in exchange?" "I don't burn you with Delvine," she said. "I don't broadcast the ledger to every organization and law enforcement body simultaneously. I walk out of this library and I go somewhere and I disappear, and you spend the rest of your career knowing I exist and that I have everything I've just told you I have." She held his eyes. "That's the deal. That's the only one." He was quiet for a long time. Outside the reading room, she could hear the library's ambient sounds. Distant footsteps, the faint percussion of a door somewhere, the particular resonance of a large institutional space. "You're asking me to let you live," he said, "with everything you know." "I've been living with everything I know for 3 years," she said. "So have you. Today is not different from yesterday in that way." "The ledger stays divided," she said, "unassembled, unusable." She paused. "Unless something happens to me, or to anyone I care about." At which point the assembly instructions in all 3 pieces reached their destinations within 6 hours. He looked at the 2 papers on the table between them. "A stalemate," he said. "A life," she said. "Both of us. Smaller than what you planned, but a life." She watched him work through it. She could see the calculation running, his legal exposure, the Delvine documentation, the ledger's potential, her specific value as the only person who could assemble it, versus her specific danger as the only person who could broadcast it. She'd built the math carefully over 14 months, and it came out the same way every time. The only world where both of them survived was the one where neither of them moved. Kane looked at her for a very long time. Then he reached out and picked up the 2 papers from the table, folded them, put them in his jacket pocket. She watched him do it. "I want the Delvine documentation verified as destroyed within 30 days, he said. "You'll receive confirmation," she said. "Through a channel you can verify. 30 days. He stood, straightened his jacket, the specific careful gesture of a man reassembling his surfaces. He looked at her one last time. "You should have run further," he said. "The first time." "I know," she said. "I'm done running now." Something crossed his face. Then he walked to the door and opened it and was gone. She sat in the reading room alone for 3 full minutes. Her hands were shaking. She let them. There was no one here to see it, and they'd earned it, and she pressed them flat against her thighs and breathed and let the shaking run its course. Then she stood up and went to the special collections desk and asked for the Harlan research box. And the woman behind the desk got it without any of the careful apologies she'd had before, and Nadine took it to a reading table and opened it and took out the small waterproof case from beneath the false bottom she'd built into the box's interior 18 months ago. And she held all 3 pieces of the master encryption key in her hands for the first time. She did not assemble it. She put all 3 cases in her jacket pocket and walked out of the library into the gray afternoon air. Vascari was still in the car. He'd moved to the passenger seat when she'd taken too long. She could see it. He didn't have the energy to maintain the driver's seat posture, and she hadn't told him he had to. He was upright, but barely, his head back against the headrest. His color the particular off-white of a man running on will, and not much else. She got in. He looked at her. She looked back at him. "The women," she said. "Becca and the woman from my building. Kane's people have them, or had them. I need to know they're clear." He already had his phone out. He made 2 calls in under 3 minutes, both short, both in the clipped exchange of men who communicated in the compressed language of people who'd worked together long enough to not need full sentences. He listened to the responses. He put the phone down. "They're clear," he said. "Becca never left her cousin's house. My people got there before Kane's." He paused. "The woman from your building was approached but not taken. She apparently hit the man with a cast iron skillet and locked herself in her bathroom." Nadine stared at the dashboard for a moment. Then she said, "Of course she did." "Kane's pulling out," Vascari said. "My people are tracking a convoy north on the interstate. He's moving fast." He looked at her. "What did you give him?" "A reason to decide I was more dangerous dead than alive," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Delvine," he said. She looked at him. "You knew about Delvine." "I suspected," he said. "He disappeared too cleanly. Kane's people had a signature on that kind of thing." He studied her face. "You've been holding it for 14 months. "Yes." "As insurance." "As the last card," she said. "The one you only play when everything else is gone." He nodded slowly. He understood that. She could see that he understood it in a way that went beyond professional, the recognition of someone who had their own last cards and had spent a long time knowing exactly where they were. "The ledger," he said. She reached into her jacket and brought out all 3 cases, set them on the console between them. He looked at them, looked at her. "I told him I wouldn't assemble it," she said. "But?" "But I told you I would," she said, "and I meant it when I said it." He was quiet. "Kane's not finished," she said. "A stalemate keeps me alive. It doesn't keep the next person alive. The next Marcus Delvine. The next person who knows too much and runs out of road." She picked up the 3 cases. "The ledger goes out, not to law enforcement alone, to every party simultaneously, every alliance, every bribery network, every account, all of it, everywhere, at the same moment, so no single entity can suppress it. That takes down organizations I have arrangements with," he said. "I know. It takes down parts of my operation." "I know that too," she said. He looked at the 3 cases in her hands. He looked at her face. He was very still in the way he was always still, except that underneath it she could see something moving. The particular internal work of a man dismantling something he'd spent a long time building and deciding whether the demolition was worth the cost. "Reyes," she said. "Where is he?" "In custody," Viscari said. "My people picked him up outside Ashridge this morning. He won't be a problem." "What does in custody mean in your context?" He met her eyes. "It means he'll answer for what he did," he said. "To me, and then to the appropriate authorities." A pause. "I have a specific interest in doing this correctly, given the circumstances." She believed him. She wasn't sure why, given everything she knew about who he was and what his business was, but she believed him. She handed him one of the cases, then the second, kept the third. "I need a laptop and a secure uplink," she said, "and a location where I can work for 4 hours without interruption." He looked at the cases in his hand. He was making a decision she could see the outline of, but not the interior. A decision about what he was, or what he was willing to be, or what the difference between those 2 things was worth to him at this specific point in his life. "I know a place," he said. 40 minutes. It took her 6 hours, not 4. The assembly was precise work and her hands were tired, and she made herself slow down twice when she felt the fatigue reaching her fingers, because precision errors at this stage would corrupt the output, and a corrupted broadcast was worse than no broadcast. It would look like manipulation rather than documentation, and Kane's people would use that immediately. Viscari slept for 3 of those hours in the room's other chair, his wounded shoulder carefully positioned, his breathing slow and even in the way of someone who had accepted that the body would take what it needed. She worked. The location was a property he owned 2 counties from Morgantown, not a residence, more of a functional space, the kind she was learning he kept in multiple places. Clean, sparse, equipped with the specific tools of people who moved through the world in ways that required flexibility. She didn't ask about it. She used what she needed. At 11:40 p.m., she sat back and looked at the screen. The broadcast architecture was complete. Every account, every routing structure, every bribery payment and hidden alliance and dark arrangement that Atlas Kane had built over 2 decades was packaged and addressed. To rival organizations, to federal task forces, to investigative journalists on 3 continents, to financial regulators in 7 countries, to every entity that had a stake in what the ledger contained. All of it at the same moment. She looked at the send command. She thought about what it would do. The specific cascade, Kane's leverage evaporating in real time as every party received simultaneously and understood simultaneously that they were not the only recipient. The architecture of fear he had maintained by making each person believe they were uniquely exposed, uniquely controlled, uniquely without options. The moment all of it became visible to everyone at once, the fear stopped working. You couldn't threaten 100 people with information they all already had. She thought about Marcus Delvine, who'd tried to get out in 2017 and hadn't made it. She pressed send. The progress bar ran for 47 seconds. She watched it. It wasn't dramatic. It was a bar on a screen in a quiet room with a sleeping man in the corner. The most significant thing she'd done in 3 years happened in silence and took less than a minute. She closed the laptop. She sat in the silence for a while. Then she woke Viscari. He came up fast the way he always did. No groggy transition, just present, his eyes finding her immediately. He read her face. "Done?" he said. "Done," she said. He looked at the closed laptop. He looked at the window where the night outside was complete and still. "Reyes," he said. "He goes to the FBI field office in Richmond tomorrow morning. I've arranged a meeting with a task force coordinator I have a complicated history with. It'll hold. He'll talk to save himself, and everything he says will be verified against what the ledger just released." "Pruitt," she said. "Pruitt is more complicated," Viscari said. His daughter shouldn't lose her father on top of everything else," she said. "He cooperates fully, complete disclosure. He gets the consideration that comes with that." He looked at her. "He was trapped," she said. "That doesn't make it right, but it makes it human. There's a difference." "You've thought about this," he said. "I've had time," she said. He nodded. He would make it happen. She could see that. Whatever the mechanism, whatever the specific arrangement, he would make it happen because she'd asked him to, and because somewhere in the last 72 hours something had shifted in the specific gravity between them, and they were both aware of it, and neither of them had said anything about it because there had been no time, and also because some things didn't need to be said immediately. "Kane will know it was me," she said. "Yes." "The Delvine documentation still holds," she said. "The copies still go to their destinations if something happens to me. That's still the insurance." "But the stalemate changed," he said. "The stalemate changed," she agreed. "He's going to lose everything in the next 72 hours as the ledger processes through every channel. He'll be looking for someone to hold responsible." She paused. "I need to be somewhere he can't reach." "Where?" Viscari said. She looked at the window, at the dark outside it. "I don't know yet," she said. "Somewhere I don't have to be Claire Novak." He was quiet for a moment. "Nadine Mercer isn't exactly safe either," he said. "Her name is in Reyes's testimony. Her name is connected to the Ledger broadcast. In 48 hours, she's going to be a person a lot of people want to find." "I know," she said. "There might be a third option," he said. "A real one. Not a name borrowed from a dead woman in Ohio." He looked at her with the careful flatness he used when he was saying something that cost him. "I have resources for that kind of thing. The correct kind. Documents that hold under real scrutiny." She looked at him for a long time. "That's not something you offer people casually," she said. "No," he said. "It isn't." The room was very quiet. Outside, somewhere distant, a vehicle passed on the county road, and its headlights swept briefly across the window and were gone. "You're going to dismantle the operation," she said. It wasn't a question. "Parts of it," he said. "The parts that can't survive what the ledger released." He said it without drama. Matter of fact, the way he said everything. "It was already changing. This accelerates the process." "What does that leave you with?" He thought about it. Actually thought she could see the consideration moving through him rather than a prepared answer. "Property?" he said. "Legitimate holdings. Some are worth keeping, some aren't." He paused. "Ashridge." She looked at him. "The buildings I bought in Ashridge," he said. "I'm establishing a community trust. It was already in process. I had a lawyer working on the structure before any of this." He met her eyes. That wasn't the operation. That was something else. She thought about the Miners' Lodge, the vacant diner, the hardware store where she'd lived for 14 months with a go-bag inside a hollow wall. "Margaret Holt's Bakery," she said. "The structure can be rebuilt," he said. "It was insured. The trust will cover reconstruction." She thought about the smell of brown butter and cardamom at 4 in the morning, about flour on her hands and the particular dark of a mountain town before anyone else was awake, about cinnamon rolls cooling on a rack while she pressed her back against a wall and counted the sounds of boots on gravel and made herself breathe. She thought about walking away from that and whether walking away from it again was something she had another version of in her. "I'm not going back as Claire Novak," she said. "No," he said. "You're not. And I don't know what I'm going back as," she said, "or whether I'm going back at all." "I know," he said. "I'm not asking you to decide that tonight." She looked at him, at the specific quality of his stillness, which she'd spent 6 weeks reading as threat and then as calculation, and now understood as something more fundamental, the quality of a man who had been in motion for so long that stillness had become a discipline, something he'd had to learn rather than something he'd been born to. She recognized that. She recognized it the way you recognized something you'd been carrying so long you'd forgotten it had weight. "Your shoulder needs a hospital," she said. "Tomorrow," he said. "Tonight," she said. He looked at her for a moment. Then he stood up, moving carefully, and reached for his jacket with his good arm. 3 months later, the last snow of the season fell on Ash Ridge. It came overnight, the quiet kind, and by morning it had covered the burned-out lot where Holt's Bakery had stood, and the construction equipment parked around it, and the framing that had gone up in the last 6 weeks. New lumber, same footprint, the particular smell of fresh-cut wood mixing with cold air in a way that was almost the smell of something beginning. Nadine Mercer, her real name, used openly for the first time in 4 years, on a driver's license and a lease agreement and a bank account and a library card for the Ashridge Public Library, stood on the sidewalk across the street and looked at the framing and felt the cold through her coat and didn't move for a while. The federal investigations had moved fast, the way they moved when the evidence arrived pre-organized and simultaneously from every direction, and there was no single point of suppression to apply pressure to. Kane's network had begun dissolving within 36 hours of the broadcast. His financial holdings were frozen within 4 days. He himself had been located, not by Viscari's people and not by any single agency, but by the convergence of several agencies that had all received the same information at the same moment and for once had no competitive reason to withhold from each other. He was in federal custody in a facility she didn't know the location of and didn't need to. Reyes had testified for 11 hours across 2 sessions and then testified for 6 more when the task force came back with follow-up questions. He was not a good man, but he was a thorough one, and his thoroughness in this specific context was useful, and the people who needed to benefit from his information were benefiting from it, and that had to be enough. Pruitt had resigned his position and cooperated fully and was navigating a process that was painful and would continue to be painful, and that she had no more influence over. She had said what she'd said to Viscari about him, and Viscari had done what he'd said he would do, and the rest was between Pruitt and the people whose job it was to weigh those things. Becca was in Ashridge. Working afternoons at the diner while the bakery was rebuilt, texting Nadine occasionally with updates about the construction pace and complaints about the diner's espresso machine, and a photograph of the framing going up that she'd captioned 4 words. "It's coming back." Nadine had looked at that photograph for a long time. She heard boots on the sidewalk behind her and didn't turn around because she knew the sound of them by now. Viscari came to stand beside her and looked at the framing. His shoulder had healed correctly. She knew because she'd been present for 2 of his follow-up appointments, waiting in cars while he went in, the specific inverse of the dynamic they'd started with. He didn't need her to wait. She'd waited anyway, and he'd accepted it without comment, which was the way they'd been handling most things. "March opening," he said, "if the weather holds." "Weather won't hold," she said. "It's Ashridge." "April then," he said. She looked at the framing, at the new lumber against the gray sky. "I talked to a lawyer in Roanoke," she said, "about the bakery license, running it under my actual name." He said nothing. He was good at saying nothing in ways that weren't silence. "It's a longer process than I expected," she said. "Background checks, business filings, a lot of things that are complicated when you've been somebody else for 3 years. I know someone who could expedite." "I know you do," she said. "I'm doing it the long way." He looked at her. She looked at the framing. "It'll take 4 or 5 months," she said, "if everything goes correctly. And if it doesn't, then longer," she said. "Either way, I'm going to be here while it happens." The snow was still coming down, the light, quiet kind that didn't demand anything. It settled on the lumber and on the sidewalk and on the shoulders of her coat, and she let it. "The trust structure is finalized," he said. "The attorney filed last week. Every property in Ashridge transfers into community management. I'm a signatory for the first 2 years, and then I'm out." "You're staying for 2 years?" she said. "For the transition," he said. "Then I'm out." She looked at him. "And after?" He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the framing the way he looked at everything, with that flat assessment, the particular patience of a man who had learned not to assume the future would match any version he imagined. "I don't know yet," he said. "That's new for me." She understood that. The not knowing, as a condition chosen rather than imposed. The specific work of standing in a place without mapping every exit. She'd been practicing it for 3 months. She hadn't gotten it right yet. She suspected it wasn't something you got right so much as something you kept doing until not doing it felt stranger than doing it. She looked at the framing one more time, at the bones of a building that had been ordinary and warm, and hers for 14 months before it burned, and was becoming something again, but not the same thing but something, and maybe that was better. Maybe rebuilt and known to be rebuilt was stronger than something that had never burned. She wasn't sure about that. But she was staying to find out. She turned up her collar against the snow and put her hands in her pockets and stood on the sidewalk in Ashridge, Virginia, on a morning in late winter with her real name and her real face and nowhere to run, and for the first time in 4 years she wasn't calculating the distance to the nearest exit. She was just standing in the snow, letting it land,